You know what's ironic? Avoidants often don't realize what they had until it's gone. But the moment an anxious partner finally walks away, really walks away, it hits differently. That silence, that absence, it becomes deafening. And suddenly, the avoidant starts to feel what they've spent so long avoiding. The anxious partner finally detaches after constant emotional exhaustion. In the beginning, they gave everything. They over-explained their feelings, made excuses for the distance, and constantly tried to bridge the emotional gap. Every ignored message, every cold response, every vague answer triggered a fear inside them, but instead of walking away, they leaned in harder. They chased clarity, they chased reassurance, and in doing so, they slowly started to abandon their own needs. They wanted connection, but it always felt just out of reach, so they worked for it. They tried to make sense of mixed signals, tried to read between the lines, tried to believe that the avoidance moments of warmth were signs of hope. But each time they opened up, they were met with a wall. And that wall didn't crumble, it only grew taller. Still, they stayed. They thought, maybe if I just say it the right way, if I'm more patient, if I love a little harder, they'll finally feel safe enough to open up. And so they loved harder. They became hyper-aware of the avoidance moods, walking on eggshells just to maintain peace. They silenced their own anxiety to keep the connection alive. They tolerated being told they were too much, too emotional, too intense, all while craving even the smallest sign that they were wanted, needed, or seen. But over time, something starts to shift. It's not dramatic. There's no explosion, no confrontation. It's more like erosion. Little by little, the emotional effort starts to feel heavy. The fear of abandonment begins to lose its grip because the pain of being ignored outweighs the fear of being alone. Where once they would have panicked at the thought of space, now they start to feel numb. Where once they overanalyzed every delay in response, now they just stop checking their phone. The anxious partner doesn't leave in anger. They leave in exhaustion. Emotional burnout takes over. They realize they've been carrying the relationship on their own, and no matter how much they give, it never brings the closeness they crave. It's not that they stop loving the avoidant, it's that they start loving themselves more. They start noticing how empty they feel after every conversation, how drained they are after every attempt to connect. And slowly they stop initiating. They stop trying to prove their worth. Something inside them clicks. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. They no longer want to fight for someone who refuses to meet them halfway. They no longer want to keep asking for basic emotional presence. The silence, the avoidance, the defensiveness, it all becomes too loud to ignore. What once felt like love now feels like self-abandonment. So they begin to detach. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. They pull their energy back. They focus inward. They start rebuilding the parts of themselves they lost trying to earn love. And here's what makes it so powerful. The avoidant doesn't see it coming because the anxious partner has always stayed. They've always come back. They've always apologized first. But this time, something is different. There are no more long messages, no more desperate calls, no more emotional pleas. There's just distance. Not the kind of distance the avoidant controls, but the kind they can't. The kind that comes when someone stops needing crumbs because they finally remembered they deserve more. The anxious partner may have once been afraid of losing the connection, but now they've reached the point where losing themselves is no longer an option. They're not cold, they're not angry, they're done. The avoidant is confronted by the emotional void left behind. At first, they may not notice anything different. They assume the silence is temporary, that the anxious partner is just taking a break or trying to prove a point. After all, this isn't the first time the anxious one has pulled back for a moment before eventually coming back with more questions, more emotions, more attempts to fix what feels broken. But as the hours turn into days and the days into weeks, something unfamiliar starts to creep in. The silence they once craved no longer feels peaceful. It starts to echo. It starts to feel unsettling. The familiar pattern is broken, and for the first time, they are no longer the one in control of the emotional temperature of the relationship. The avoidant, who used to feel suffocated by closeness and overwhelmed by intimacy, now starts to feel something else entirely, emptiness. The texts that used to flood in have stopped. The calls, the emotional check-ins, the reminders of being cared for, they're all gone. And suddenly, the absence becomes loud. It disrupts their routine. It challenges the belief that the anxious partner would always be there, always waiting, always giving. There's a discomfort in the quiet they can't quite explain. They try to fill it with distractions, work, socializing, hobbies, even casual dating, but nothing quite replaces the emotional presence they once took for granted. They scroll through old conversations and realize how many times they were met with love, with understanding, with effort, and how often they responded with coldness or withdrawal. They replay moments when the anxious partner asked for reassurance, and instead of giving it, they distance themselves. They remember how they minimized emotions, how they avoided vulnerability, how they built walls so high that even someone who tried everything couldn't climb them. And now there's no one left on the other side trying. The avoidant starts to feel the consequences of the space they once protected so fiercely. What once felt like safety now feels like isolation. There's no one asking how their day was, no one checking in, no one reminding them they matter. And for the first time, they start to question if their definition of safety was actually just fear in disguise. They realize that the emotional independence they were chasing came at the cost of connection. They look at the absence not just as a lack of noise, but as a presence of something else. Regret. Regret for not showing up. Regret for not appreciating the effort. Regret for making someone feel like their love was too much. They begin to see how the anxious partner wasn't asking for too much. They were asking for the bare minimum: honesty, communication, emotional presence. And now, stripped of the reassurance they once resented, the avoidant starts to crave it. Not because they suddenly became anxious themselves, but because they're finally feeling what they were avoiding all along: loss. Real, tangible loss. Not hypothetical. Not a passing fear. Actual absence. They can no longer tell themselves the story that they're better off alone, because alone no longer feels empowering. It feels painful. It feels quiet. They notice how much space the anxious partner used to take up, not in a way that was overbearing, but in a way that made them feel alive, seen, cared for. And now, with that space empty, they start to see themselves more clearly too. They see the patterns, the defense mechanisms, the way they thought detachment protected them, when really it just pushed away the very thing they needed most. Reflection leads the avoidant to realize how much they pushed love away. It doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in slowly, through quiet moments they never used to sit with. They begin to notice how they used silence as a weapon, how withholding affection became a shield, how they treated closeness like a threat instead of a gift. They start to look back at the way the anxious partner tried, how they reached out, how they softened themselves to be understood, how they made space for the avoidant's fears without fully knowing how deep those fears ran. The avoidant begins to see how they confused love with pressure, how they mistook emotional needs for demands, how they interpreted care as control. They begin to replay the moments where they rolled their eyes at vulnerability, where they shut down instead of leaning in, where they walked away just when the other person was getting close. In those memories, they start to feel what they couldn't allow themselves to feel in real time: guilt, regret, sadness. It becomes clearer that the distance they insisted on keeping wasn't about the other person being too much. It was about their own inability to hold intimacy without feeling overwhelmed. The walls they built weren't a sign of strength. They were symptoms of fear: fear of being truly seen, fear of depending on someone, fear of being hurt in the ways they promised themselves they never would be again. But now they start to question what all that protection really cost. In protecting themselves from being hurt, they hurt someone else. In choosing safety, they sacrificed connection. In avoiding the discomfort of emotional closeness, they missed the joy that comes with being truly loved. As they sit with these realizations, the memories that once felt blurry start to take shape. They remember the way the anxious partner lit up when they shared something real. They remember the times that partner held space for them, even when they weren't fully present. They remember the softness, the persistence, the way they were loved not for what they did, but simply for who they were. And they remember how they didn't let themselves feel it, how they brushed it off, how they minimized it, and eventually how they let it go. They start to understand how love was always right there, knocking at the door, and they were too afraid to open it. The moments they once dismissed as drama now look like pleas for connection. The conversations they avoided now look like invitations to be known. The space they kept now feels like a missed opportunity to build something lasting. The realization settles in that love didn't walk away because it stopped caring. Love walked away because it was no longer being met. And now, with time and space creating room for clarity, the avoidant sees that they didn't lose love because it disappeared. They lost it because they refused to let it in. The realization is sharp, Not because they didn't know what they were doing in the moment, but because they knew and still chose the familiar discomfort of distance over the unknown beauty of vulnerability. They weren't just pushing someone away, they were pushing away the very thing they claimed they wanted but never learned how to receive. And now that it's gone, they can finally feel the weight of what they rejected. Not just the person, but the possibility. The possibility of something real, something warm, something worth holding on to. Regret sets in, but the anxious partner is no longer waiting. At first, the avoidant holds on to a quiet hope that maybe things can go back to how they were. Maybe the anxious partner just needed space. Maybe they'll reach out again like they always did. Maybe another emotional message or heartfelt question will pop up and open the door back to familiar territory. But it doesn't come. Days pass, then weeks, and the avoidant starts to feel the weight of their own choices. The absence becomes a mirror, and in it they see the impact of their patterns. The defensive responses, the cold silences, the emotional unavailability, it all comes rushing back, but this time it doesn't feel justified. It feels heavy. It feels unnecessary. The regret begins to take shape, not just as a feeling, but as a series of vivid memories. They remember the nights when their partner asked for closeness, and they responded with distance. The moments when vulnerability was offered with shaking hands, and they turned away. They remember how often they chose to protect their sense of control instead of choosing connection. And now all the things they used to avoid start to haunt them. Commitment, intimacy, showing up. Not because they're scary, but because they finally understand what they lost by running from them. They realize that the anxious partner didn't want perfection, they just wanted presence. They didn't need constant reassurance, they needed honest connection. But the avoidant mistook that for pressure, mistook need for neediness, mistook love for expectation. And now, with no one left trying, they begin to feel a longing they can't escape. They try to rationalize it at first. They convince themselves they're just lonely, that time will fix it, that someone else will come along eventually. But that kind of comfort doesn't last, because deep down they know this wasn't just any connection. It was someone who saw them through all their defenses and chose them anyway. Someone who stayed patient through the silence, who tried to love them without demanding they become someone else. And instead of leaning into that, they pushed it away. So now they sit with the consequences. They reach for their phone and hesitate, not because they don't want to reach out, but because they know the response may not come. The dynamic has shifted. The anxious partner is no longer checking for signs, no longer waiting for change, no longer hoping that one day the avoidant will wake up and see the damage. Because now they've already moved on, not necessarily to another person, but to another version of themselves. One that no longer begs for love to stay. One that no longer sees silence as a challenge to be solved, but as a sign to walk away. One that has learned peace in absence instead of anxiety in presence. The avoidant, who once had the power to offer love but withheld it, now finds themselves on the other side of the experience, wanting to give, but with no one there to receive. The words they once struggled to say now come easily, but they have nowhere to land. The affection they once buried under sarcasm and avoidance now rises to the surface, but it meets an empty space. They begin to grasp that love is not a resource that waits around. It doesn't stay frozen in time until we're ready. It's fluid. It grows or it leaves. And in this case, it left, not out of bitterness, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Because the anxious partner finally understood that love shouldn't feel like a battle for emotional scraps. They walked away not because they stopped caring, but because they started choosing themselves. And the avoidant, in their quiet realization, starts to feel not just the weight of what they lost, but the deeper ache of knowing that they were the one who let it slip through their fingers. The power dynamic shifts, healing begins with the one who let go. For so long, the anxious partner existed in a cycle where they felt powerless. Powerless to change the emotional climate, powerless to get the closeness they needed, powerless to stop chasing love that always felt like it was just out of reach. They spent so much time analyzing every interaction, trying to decode what the avoidant was thinking, trying to adjust themselves to be more acceptable, less intense, more easygoing, anything to keep the connection alive. But now something is different. The very moment they chose to walk away without drama, without begging, without needing closure, the dynamic they once felt trapped in began to dissolve. By reclaiming their energy, they started to remember their worth. The anxious partner is no longer the one bending over backward to maintain something one-sided. They're no longer staying in spaces that feel unsafe, unclear, or emotionally inconsistent. Instead, they begin to take all the energy they once gave away and pour it into themselves. And in doing so, they start to feel a strength they didn't even realize they had. The need to be chosen dissolves into the decision to choose themselves. Their self-worth is no longer tied to someone else's ability to show up. The need to fix, to understand, to wait, it fades. And that shift is powerful. The anxious partner begins healing not by finding someone new, but by finally becoming someone new to themselves, someone who no longer tolerates being breadcrumbed, someone who no longer feels they need to earn love through emotional labor, someone who knows that peace is not a product of another person's approval, but something they can create within themselves. Meanwhile, the avoidant starts to feel the ground beneath them change. The control they once had over the pace and depth of the relationship is no longer in their hands. The anxious partner is no longer reacting, no longer available to be pulled in and pushed away. And that creates a sense of imbalance the avoidant isn't used to feeling, where once they were the emotionally detached one who dictated the rhythm of the connection, they now find themselves wondering what went wrong, what they missed, how they lost someone who loved them so deeply. The roles have reversed, not out of revenge or manipulation, but through the natural consequence of emotional growth. The one who always waited no longer waits. The one who always asked questions no longer needs answers. The one who constantly reached out has let go. And in that space, something begins to unfold. The avoidant is now left with their own patterns, their own resistance, their own discomfort. The silence they once relied on to create distance now amplifies everything they didn't want to face. And the anxious partner, far from bitter, starts to rise, not from a place of pride, but from a place of clarity. They see the emotional chaos for what it was, not love, but survival, not connection, but a trauma bond. And as they continue to distance themselves, they stop seeing the avoidant as someone to save or win back. They start to understand that true love doesn't require abandoning yourself. They make peace with the past, not by rewriting it, but by learning from it. Their healing isn't loud or public, it's quiet, steady, and rooted in the decision to never settle for less than mutual effort again. And that inner transformation, that calm strength, is what truly shifts the power. The anxious partner becomes the secure one, not because someone else changed, but because they did. Because they finally stopped searching for safety in someone else and started building it within. The avoidant begins to question their own emotional blueprint, the way they've been moving through relationships, the patterns they've repeated without fully understanding. In the silence left behind by the one who used to mirror back their fears and unmet needs, they are left alone with themselves. Not just with the loss, but with the truth of why they couldn't hold on to what they claimed to want. And that truth doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in through ordinary moments, through the quiet that no longer feels restful but restless. They notice how they flinch at vulnerability, how they've always needed control, how they confuse stability with stagnation, how their need for space was often just a mask for fear of being seen too deeply. They remember times in childhood or early relationships where they learned to protect themselves by disconnecting. Times when closeness meant chaos, or when expressing need meant being let down. They realize how long they've been performing strength by staying distant, when in reality, they've just been avoiding pain. The emotional detachment they wore like armor now starts to feel like a cage. And the person who once held up a mirror to all their avoidant tendencies is now gone, no longer there to confront or comfort, no longer trying to pull them into connection. The absence forces a confrontation they've avoided for years. The reality that love requires presence, participation, and a willingness to risk being hurt. You begin to unpack the stories they've told themselves, that they don't need anyone, that feelings are messy, that depending on someone is dangerous. And suddenly, those beliefs start to feel less like truths and more like inherited scripts, outdated defenses written by a younger version of themselves trying to survive. They start to consider what it would mean to unlearn that story. To not just miss the anxious partner, but to understand why they couldn't meet them emotionally, why they mistook intensity for instability, why they felt overwhelmed by someone simply wanting to be close. And that understanding doesn't come with shame, it comes with clarity. Clarity that healing isn't just about longing for someone who's gone, it's about becoming someone different for whoever comes next. They begin to think less about how to get the anxious partner back and more about how to break the cycle. They ask themselves deeper questions. What am I really afraid of when someone gets close? What do I believe will happen if I'm truly seen? Why do I push away what I want most? They begin to notice how they shut down in conflict, how they intellectualize emotions instead of feeling them, how they need to retreat when things get real. They stop blaming others for asking for more and start examining why they always feel like less is safer. The discomfort becomes a teacher, the loneliness becomes a signal, the loss becomes a catalyst. And slowly they consider that maybe the anxious partner wasn't too much. Maybe their capacity for love simply outpaced the avoidant's ability to receive it. They look back not just with regret, but with responsibility. They recognize the fork in the road, keep repeating the same patterns and losing the same kind of people, or begin the painful, necessary work of change. They understand that healing doesn't happen in the comfort zone, that connection doesn't survive behind emotional walls, that love can't grow in the absence of emotional risk. They begin to see that true safety is not found in control, but in vulnerability. And while the anxious partner may no longer be there, the reflection they offered remains, echoing through the silence and challenging the avoidant to step out of hiding, not for anyone else, but for themselves.